In recent weeks, Cassidy Hutchinson, a former aide to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, has become a star witness and something also of a media darling for her testimony before the January 6th Special Committee, which has held primetime hearings with people like Hutchinson and Hutchinson herself in recent weeks. She has testified against the former president. She has testified that she was disgusted by the lie she saw on January 6th, the lie she saw affect what happened to the Capitol on January 6th, but a new report from the Federalist peels back the curtain on what Cassidy Hutchinson was saying in private shortly before she would pivot to testifying in front of the January 6th committee and even embracing Liz Cheney after her testimony. Liz Cheney is obviously a Republican member of the House of Representatives who has really steered these hearings in a direction that has been completely opposed to, of course, former President Trump, and has been very detrimental to her own party, but also, I would say, untruthful in several respects. And one thing we're about to find out is from the Federalist report that my colleagues, it is excellent journalism from my colleagues, Mollie Hemingway and Tristan. You can see the screenshot right here. It's an exclusive to the Federalist because we have exclusive, Mollie and Tristan have exclusive information, exclusive text messages that they've reviewed and confirmed that show that Hutchinson was singing a very different tune in private shortly before she decided to testify before the committee. You can see it in the headline. In private, Cassidy Hutchinson joked about the riot, called the January 6th committee, quote, phony, and praised Trump before changing her story. So I'll start scrolling through it and you can see here is a text message. I'm 100% going to do a Trump filter for my Zoom background when I'm subpoenaed. Like it'll be Trump standing outside Mar-a-Lago, or maybe the iconic picture of him and Melania in Trump Tower surrounded by gold furniture. And you can see here, they're just trading back examples. So it's clearly a joke to them, but clearly a joke in the direction of being in favor of the former president. Here's what she texted. This is a conversation she says she had with a stranger in DC where she identified, she was walking with a 45 sweatshirt and identified as an insurrectionist, put her headphones in, and that was the end of that. You can see even here, these are private communications that Cassidy Hutchinson was making. She is saying, I think Liz Cheney being, quote, the future of the GOP is a massive stretch. And it keeps going on and on and on. She was capitalizing on her connections to Mark Meadows before she attacked him in her January 6th committee. And these ones, to me, are real standouts. You can see how frustrated she was with the media coverage of her, of the January 6th committee in these communications right here. She's upset with coverage from Politico's Kyle Cheney, who she said had her, quote, red hot mad. Here's that quote from Mollie and Tristan's report right there. She said she wanted to be like, the members literally told you, Kyle Cheney, they're taking advantage of us. So shut the F up and stop tweeting about me. Leave me alone. There is no story here, Hutchinson wrote in a series of messages, according to Mollie and Tristan's reporting. She also claimed that Jim Acosta contacted her and said, thank you for your bravery and courage. We and the American people look forward to learning more from your testimony. And Hutchinson went off in these private messages. She said she had about 20 snarky messages to respond, but said, stop warping everything. And she couldn't give less of an F what CNN thinks of her truly. So the picture from this report that is just out, it's up on the Federalist website from Mollie and Tristan, is a very different one than what we've seen from Cassidy Hutchinson over the course of her testimony in front of the January 6th committee. And Mollie and Tristan actually make quite an interesting point here about the lawyers. And this is actually quite relevant because this is they give a flavor of some of the coverage. CNN has said Hutchinson's revelations were, quote, worse than John Dean's testimony in Watergate. The Boston Globe said they were, quote, more impressive. NPR called them explosive. The Bulwark called her, quote, a heroine. The Washington Post said her commentary was damning, quote, damning. And again, this is a series of private communications from December 2020 through May of 2021. So less than a year, May 2021, less than a year, you have some of this commiseration, as Mollie Hemingway and Tristan Justice wrote, with other targets of the probe. And far from being upset with Trump, this is Tristan and Mollie's words, Hutchinson repeatedly spoke in favor of him and his presidency. It's a very, very, very different tune that she was singing in private. I would rather shoot myself dead into the Potomac than see Marine One flying around the city without 45 again. That's 5 months after. 5 months after January 6th. Think about that. She even had used the phrase, quote, stop the steal. And then she flipped to saying, this is really important. She goes from saying, stop the steal, to saying she was upset about, and excuse me while I scroll through this, to saying that she was disgusted. It was unpatriotic. We were watching the Capitol building get defaced over a lie, and it was something that was really hard in that moment to digest. All right, so it is basically impossible to square these two circles, right? That you have somebody who says in the moment she was completely disgusted and saw this as unpatriotic and saw this as a lie, who is also in private at that same time from December 2020 to May 2021, commiserating with other staffers and being completely pro-Trump and using the phrase stop the steal as though she agreed entirely with the president's point about, or the president's claims when it came to the 2020 election. It is virtually impossible to say that that's consistent and to say that there is absolutely no deception at play in the way that Cassidy Hutchinson presents herself right now versus how she presented herself at the time. That's almost impossible. And so the media, there were some holes poked in her testimony a little bit. You might remember the story about you might remember the story about the what's a good example? The story about the SUV that the president was in, and him apparently saying he wanted to that he wanted to seize the wheel on January 6th after his speech and go to the Capitol. Other people have said that just wasn't plausible anyway. And you can see here, I was searching for the anecdote in the story. It's not an anecdote. It's a great part of this report where they note that a well-positioned lawyer offered to represent Hutchinson pro bono. The change in attorneys coincided with a complete turnabout in her story and a dramatically different posture towards Cheney. Now, some targets of the January 6th committee subpoenas and their probe had actually had a really hard time finding a lawyer because it costs an incredible sum of money when you need that level of legal representation. And Cassidy Hutchinson ended up being set up with a pro bono lawyer that was sort of pushed her way by Never Trump people. Never Trump people have said, Alyssa Fair, for instance, have said that they were the ones that convinced her to, present her testimony to the public. Again, it is virtually impossible to say that Cassidy Hutchinson is presenting honestly an honest depiction of what she herself thought. Back then, it does show where the incentives are in Washington, D.C. when it comes to people who have worked for former President Trump. Is the incentive to, the media likes to present that, and this is a really important part of Liz Cheney's case and the case that people are making. They are trying to make this point that Republicans that are testifying before the January 6th committee they only have something to lose, right? Like, these are lifelong loyal Republicans who only have something to lose by going in front of the January 6th committee and standing on their principles. Actually, what this shows is that the incentives shift in DC, here in Washington, DC, where I am right now. The incentive is not to be, it's hardly to be a Trump loyalist. If anything, for people who want to work in Washington, D.C., that's a pretty difficult thing to do here, because it's harder to get jobs. I mean, whatever you think of Trump, it's obviously harder to get jobs. It's harder to be a part of the social professional scene and the network here. And when Cassidy Hutchinson sort of changed her tune and started getting praised by the media, that is perfectly clear. I don't even have to make the argument, because the media makes it for us. Like, the experiment was run and we've seen the results. And so the incentives are clearly in a certain direction. And so the January 6th committees and its supporters' contention that all of this is just really brave people sacrificing to stand on their principles, they have nothing to gain, is outrageous. It's ludicrous. It's just flat out stupid. If anything, it's clear that they do have, social cash to be gained from social and professional cash to be gained from testifying. And that's a really important part of all of this. And if they had cross-examinations like a real committee, this would have been brought out in front of the witnesses. But instead, what we're seeing is essentially a show trial that is perfectly engineered for prime time by a literal television producer, former head of ABC News. If you watch it, which I tried to not do, I tried to just look at the reporting instead of watching it, because it seems like such a waste of time. If you watch it, you see how produced it was, heavily produced to feel like a compelling true crime type docuseries. And with little clips here and there, it's completely alien from the other types of congressional committees and testimonies that you see on a normal basis. And that's because, honestly, or I should say, what happened with that is that it's not particularly honest. It's not a particularly serious depiction of what happened on January 6th. If you watch our channel, if you read the Federalist regularly, if you listen to Federalist Radio Hour, I've talked before about my experience reporting outside the Capitol on that day. It was disgusting. It was horrible, but the committee is barely scraping the surface. It's completely aimed in a partisan direction, and there's so little actually being learned about the security failures on January 6th, about the very, very real problems that led to Capitol Police being overrun by a mob. How did that happen? Why did that happen? This committee has nothing to do with that. It's trying to make this connection between Donald Trump's words and the riot. And the sad fact of the matter for the media is that Donald Trump, who I don't think behaved particularly virtuously you may disagree with me on that, and that's fine, between the election and the inauguration. Again, you can disagree with me, and that's fine. But they're trying to say that this man that told people to be peaceful was secretly hoping that there would be violence that would keep him in office and further tar his reputation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's never been a strong case that Donald Trump was involved in legal incitement. And you can say, what some people have, that he was reckless in the way that he was talking about the election, and the only outcome would have been a January 6th. You can make that argument. That's not what this committee is doing. And what this committee is doing is not by any means trying to figure out legitimately what happened, because what actually happened on January 6th was a structural, an incredible failure of our national security, of our security. You hear so little conversation about that. It's all aimed in a partisan direction at undermining Donald Trump and the Republican Party in an election year, and in the sort of made-for-TV format. And you know what? That's actually really sad to me, because I think there's an incredible level of institutional distrust in this country, and it comes from the media misleading the public, promising to tell the truth, promising to be neutral, and misleading the public time and again. And people have no idea who to trust, and that's entirely reasonable. Having no trust in the media is entirely reasonable. Having no trust in the Democratic Party is entirely reasonable. Frankly, having very little trust in the Republican Party or no trust in the Republican Party is entirely reasonable. We are lied to by our institutions, the media, everything, time and again. And the January 6th committee is making that worse. It is making the conditions that led to January 6th, that were not just Donald Trump, but a media that nobody could trust, and a media, frankly, that nobody can trust. And that's not to excuse politicians misleading or lying at all, but we have a fourth estate so that we can better figure out, piece together when presidents and politicians are telling the truth and when they're not, and what the truth really looks like. And sort of getting to that, we're just the average citizen is just as smart as the average journalist, and they don't need journalists to push them in the direction of what to believe. They need the facts. So the January 6th committee is not even approaching that, and I think it's a real shame. And I think this reporting from my colleagues, Mollie and Tristan, is excellent because it shows exactly where the incentives are. It shows exactly how distorted the January 6th committee's presentation of what happened on that day is. And that's frankly because there's no cross-examination of witnesses. And that's a show trial, and it's not productive. It's not constructive. It is not ultimately helpful to the American people. So for all of their waxing sanctimoniously about democracy and patriotism, they are making the situation demonstrably worse, frankly. So I encourage everyone to go read this article over at the Federalist from my colleagues, Mollie Hemingway and Tristan Justice. It is exclusive to us. You can see the screenshots. You can read the text right there on the website. So make sure to check that out. And we'll be back more over here. We'll be back with more over here very soon.